Rush Medical in Chicago, was named after the only doctor to have signed the Declaration of Independence, and Dr. Rush had taught Clark of Lewis and Clark the doctoring skills he needed for his adventure to the Pacific. While Dr. Bob was at Rush Medical, the Sadlers from Battle Creek had just graduated the year before in 1906, and the Sadlers were practicing medicine in Chicago by blending science with the Bible. William Samuel Sadler was born in Indiana 4 years before Dr. Bob, and he'd moved to Michigan to work at the Battle Creek Sanitarium that was owned by the health pioneers, the Kellogg's, who had invented granola. Sadler married one of the Kellogg women when he was 22 years old, and her name was Lena Celestial Kellogg, and her uncle was the senior Kellogg who was running the world-famous Battle Creek Sanitarium, and he was also a surgeon. Lena would become a very important doctor in Chicago, working alongside her husband, Bill Sadler. And some of the patients who went to Battle Creek included Henry Ford and Thomas Edison and Amelia Earhart and the news broadcaster Lowell Thomas. In 1902, Kellogg's Battle Creek Sanitarium had burned to the ground, so the Kellogg's had built it back twice as large the following year, a new brick building 6 stories high that cost $900,000. And it had a solarium and a palm court, and this prominent health enterprise of the Kellogg's would have been well known to the students and faculty of Rush Medical when Dr. Bob Smith arrived in Chicago in 1905. Bill Sadler and Lena were the same age, and they'd gone to medical school together at the American Medical Missionary College in Battle Creek, which also held classes at Rush Medical in Chicago, and they had transferred to Rush to complete their degrees. And when they graduated together in 1906, they practiced medicine in Chicago and wrote books, and they spoke on the Chautauqua circuit. Sometime between 1906 and 1910, the Sadlers tried to help a man who was always talking in his sleep, and he channeled entities that seemed to be from another planet. And what the sleeping person said would be written down for publication in the Urantia book. The Sadlers gathered a group of 30 people together to review notes taken from what the sleeping channeler had said, and they came up with questions to ask the alien entities. And this work began in 1925, and they added writers until they had around 486 people. And the Urantia book was finally published on the 12th of October in 1955. The writers had stopped work on the book in 1942 because the entities had told them it was not yet time, and they had to wait until the aliens finally gave them permission to publish it in 1955. The first 1,300 pages of the Urantia book were about the government of the universe, and the last 800 pages were about the life of Jesus. And the book said there is a divisional headquarters of archangels on our, quote, lowly and confused planet, close quote, which people in outer space find startling and wondrous. Tourists who come here are amazed that an archangel headquarters is on a medium-sized backwards planet, and they're equally in awe of the Jesus dispensation, which they keep bringing up over and over, but the more they talk about it, the less they admit they know. They say that Jesus' manifestation is a marvelous mystery that everyone is busy watching, and apparently Jesus had gotten permission from some very high and mighties to make an early appearance here after he had practiced on some other planets first, and he had promised them also that he would return someday. The reporting angels in the Urantia book are pretty well baffled by the whole Jesus performance, and they record his entire life in painstaking detail anyway, stating that they are acting on the principle of faith. The Urantia book said that the big God is not an energy force, but a personality all his own. And the major theme of the Urantia book is about the virtue and adventure of faith, as well as a divine adherence to progression by evolution rather than revolution by revelation. The book said that at the universe headquarters, one day is 1,000 years of our years long, And the sea of glass is an enormous circular crystal 100 miles around and 30 miles deep that is used as a transmitter. And angels called life carriers bring the seeds of life to new planets, and then more and more angels come to help the evolution of humans as time goes on. Had the ancestral frog of all humanity jumped 2 inches less on a certain occasion, the whole course of evolution would have been markedly changed. Urantia book, Chicago, Urantia Foundation, 1955-1973, page 706. Life on Earth had gotten off to a slow start because the planetary prince whose name was Lucifer and his legions of angels didn't show up for 500,000 years after the first humans appeared, and by the time Lucifer arrived, the races had been getting along on their own and had been developing their own customs and habits that were hard to break. Something else abnormal about planet Earth, which they called Urantia, was that the 6 colored races came out of only one pair of humans who birthed 5 red, 2 orange, 4 yellow, 2 green, 4 blue, and 2 purple children. When the time was right, the universe headquarters would send ultraviolet upsteppers to improve the human genetic stock, and that would happen after the emergence of the human will. And that usually happened soon after the color races had emerged, but it happened backwards on Earth. And when the planetary prince had to officially report for duty 100,000 years later, his job had become too difficult because the early humans were, quote, exceedingly individualistic, extremely suspicious, and unbelievably quarrelsome, close quote. So Lucifer soon enough led a rebellious mutiny against having to babysit the people of planet Earth. There were already 500 million primitive humans on Urantia when Lucifer arrived to take up the job of planetary prince, and he was said to have had, quote, a certain characteristic restlessness coupled with a tendency to disagree with the established order, close quote. Urantia book, page 741. In addition to all the invisible angels that came with him, the planetary prince had 100 staff members who were superhuman angels that had human bodies, and these 100 helpers could live forever by eating from the tree of life, and they were, quote, supposedly non-sexual and non-material, close quote, but could make babies that were called midwayers, and they were invisible to humans. The Urantia book said that many of these midwayers are still active on our planet after all these years, and that the frog that almost died had been their third choice, while they had 1,000 other possible specimens to try if that frog didn't make it. The whole process would have taken a little longer, but what's a few hundred in so many, many millions of years? And so 165,000 years after Lucifer's rebellion, a material son and daughter were sent named Adam and Eve, and they were sent even though our planet was backwards and dark and confused as the result of the Lucifer mutiny. Adam and Eve had volunteered because they trusted the good angels that came along with them. And around 40,000 years ago, the planetary prince and his 100 helpers had gotten the humans to build a Garden of Eden as the prince's headquarters in Mesopotamia. And it was a sprawling brick structure with the tree of life growing in the middle, and it had a kind of fruit that allowed the 100 helpers to live forever. Adam and Eve needed that same fruit because they only ate once a day and absorbed the rest of their energy directly from sunlight with the help of the tree of life. And Adam and Eve had always shimmered a little, which is why people painted them with halos. The early humans were taught the golden rule by the 100 helpers, and Eskimos would settle disputes by having opponents ridicule each other and then have the audience cheer for the winner. The Eskimos had come west from England to North America over a land bridge, and Eskimos were the only surviving relatives of the original Earth people, while everyone else were hybrids that came after the emergence of the colored peoples. The headquarters was a school, and they took in students from all the outlying tribes and taught them to cook and to preserve food and to weave and to tan leather and to dig wells and irrigate crops and use the wheel. And they taught them to bury their garbage and to shake hands rather than drinking each other's blood. Teaching the early humans to bury their dead had been an uphill lesson because they'd been leaving corpses suspended in trees for so many tens of thousands of years that it was a tough habit to overcome. Lucifer's argument was that it was an unpleasant job babysitting emerging civilizations, and anything that helped speed up the process was worth trying, especially breeding with the human women. And instead of patiently waiting for evolution to unfold, the bad angels obtrusively interfered with God's divine plan. The rebellious angels would appear directly in their shimmering forms so they looked like gods, and that always made humans immediately obey them, and that way was so much easier than having to walk among humans in disguise, discreetly pointing out solutions that the humans would adopt after time-consuming and clumsy experimentation, and the evil angels preferred being treated as gods rather than acting as anonymous ambassadors. The rebellion on planet Earth interfered with the emergence of the 6 colored peoples, who were supposed to mix to become an olive gray color, and on ordinary planets, the red man usually came first, followed by the other colors after periods of time. The red people were usually the first to develop a civilization, but reds on Urantia fought among themselves for lack of having help from a decent planetary prince. And the red people were so busy fighting with each other that the yellow people were able to chase them out of Asia. The red people left for North America before the Alaskan land bridge sunk, and they left remnants of their genes behind in the yellow people on the Kamchatka Peninsula. And then the red people killed off the mastodons. In North America, the red people continued to fight each other until a great Californian seduced them to peace, and his descendants are now mainly in the Blackfoot tribe. But after he died at the age of 96, the red man went back to fighting and never made much of a civilization. Because of their isolation, the red men missed out on later race improvements called upstepping that has something to do with the ultraviolet people, but the writers of the Urantia book do not give details because they don't understand it themselves, and they also say that the process is supposed to be a secret. The yellow people were the first to settle down and farm the land, and while they weren't as intellectual as the red man, they were more social and survived because they got along with each other. The reds and the yellows who blended in Asia were pushed out to the north and down into the Asian peninsula and onto the South Sea Islands by the tribes who prided themselves on remaining more purely yellow, and in Indonesia there are 13,000 islands in which to hide from the Chinese. The orange people came next, and they liked to build things up, such as big stone mounds, just to see which tribe could build the biggest one. And the orange people were killed off in the lower Nile Valley in Egypt by the green people, who almost destroyed themselves in the process, although a large group of greens made their way into Burma. The remnants of the orange and green people were absorbed by the other races, especially the purple people, heading for Africa, where they also missed the final upstepping. The blue people were the first to make a good spear, and they went and lived in Europe and mated with the Neanderthals. And the life carriers hated it when their humans bred with inferior strains, but they didn't seem to mind them mixing with Neanderthals because of the common ancestry. The Neanderthal genes gave the blue man an inborn inferiority complex, added to the guilt to which they were prone from having been badly affected by the Lucifer problem, and the quote-unquote white races are descended from these blue people after being mixed with remnants of the other colors, and the blue race on planet Earth was more polluted than other blue people on worlds far away in the universe. An amalgamated race, quote, with potential, close quote, lived in the South American highlands, and amalgamated meant an olive shade of the violet hue, and these came from a small group of mixed orange and blue men who had followed the red man to America, then went south in 3 groups to settle in Mexico and in Central and South America, where they joined with a group of mixed yellows and reds, and the South Americans received a little upstepping. As it was, The red man could not rule the white man, and he would not willingly serve him. In such circumstance, if the two races do not blend, one or the other is doomed. Urantia book, page 720. Some blue people went south from the garden and mixed with other races, mostly yellow people, and then they were upstepped to become today's Arabs. And India was a blend of the three complementary races, orange, green, and purple. And the complementary races were biologically superior. Each of the primary races had gifts that the complementary colors raised to an art form. So for the red man's gift of spirituality, the Egyptian green men elevated religion into building the pyramids and devising their Book of the Dead. Their belief in a life beyond compelled the green men to make innumerable mummies, and both red and green colors shared a love of pictorial writing, while hieroglyphics were far and away the more advanced than the primitive symbols used by the red man, and the first writing had been a commercial advertisement for salt. The yellow man's picture writing tended more towards an alphabet, and the complement of the yellow man with their gift of being social were the purple people, who took that socialism into their superior churches and their community clubs, while the downside of that tendency to be social found them entrapped on plantations. And it should be noted that the yellow men were the only ones to make communism work. The third and final primary color, blue, had the gift of being technological, able to develop machines and language and governments that their complement, the orange people, would raise into an art form by welcoming the blue man and their technology and using it to create the most pleasant, welcoming homes on the planet, as well as becoming the most ingenious industrial workers and the most formidable soldiers. It should be noted that, quote, in spite of the partial Adamic default, the higher types did blend. Urantia book, page 898. The blue man developed the alphabet, while the red man and the yellow man stuck to their symbols and pictorial writing, and when Lucifer defaulted, much of all human language was lost. And they also lost the 7 commandments that had been written on stone tablets, which are now underwater offshore of Mesopotamia and Persia. Humans had first been collectors, and then they became hunters, and the Eskimos were the first people to build boats, even though many of them died trying. Eskimos went to Greenland and Iceland and mixed with some blue people later on, and some Eskimos blended with red people around the Hudson Bay. And when more alien angels were finally sent to help the struggling planet of Urantia, the humans were taught to tame animals and shown how to domesticate dogs and cattle. After learning to tame animals, the men got it into their heads that women were like animals, good for breeding and working in the fields, and instead of going hunting, the men started staying home to make life hell for the women instead of helping with the housework. The men were trying to act like gods, and the aliens felt bad about it. And the Urantia book said, quote, the men of the pastoral ages had great love for their cattle, all the more pity they could not have developed a deeper affection for their wives, close quote. Urantia book, page 769. Early tribes had expected women to fight too, but the Lucifer problem had changed men's attitudes about them, and women were no longer allowed to share in the glory of warfare, but were left behind at home. After Adam and Eve arrived, the angel aliens taught humans to become farmers, and Adam and Eve were gardeners, not shepherds. Work with the soil is not a curse, rather it is the highest blessing to all who are thus permitted to enjoy the most human of all human activities. Urantia book, page 752. The angels made the Garden of Eden the most beautiful place on earth, but first they built a brick wall to keep out the rest of the primitive humans. Inside the wall they built enough homes in Eden for 1 million people, and the garden was only 1/4 finished when Adam and Eve arrived, but it already had 12,000 miles of paths and roads. Adam and Eve would inspect the garden by flying over it on large passenger birds called fandors. These enormous birds are able to carry 1 or 2 average-sized men for a non-stop flight of over 500 miles. On some planets these birds are of great service, since they possess a high order of intelligence, often being able to speak many words of the language of the realm. Urantia book, page 590. The humans learned to make pots from the angel aliens, and they were also taught how to dance, and they learned reading and writing and were taught how to use money. After a few years at the Garden of Eden school, the human students would be sent back to their original tribes, where they could pass on to their brethren what they had learned. Adam and Eve were telepathic up to 50 miles, and they were ultraviolet colored, and after Lucifer's rebellion the bad angels couldn't read minds anymore. The plan had been to bring a representative form of government that would replace the monarchy of the material son and daughter. But Adam and Eve had found very few tribes worthy of any kind of republican government, and the whole plan had started to go sideways. All the other material sons and daughters from Adam and Eve's generation had gone to nice planets with helpful planetary princes, but here on Earth was a grudging and bitter leftover sovereign with most of his power taken away, who brooded and threatened and was often hostile, and Adam and Eve tried to warn people not to listen to him and his friends, but it didn't do much good because the evil angels were invisible. Noble Van the Archangel had whipped off a letter to headquarters, and Lucifer had declared martial law rather than give up using the fruit of the tree of life, which he had also been giving to the humans to get them to follow him, and he'd also been using the fruit to excess. When the police came to arrest him, Lucifer fled and ensconced himself and his friends on Mount Olympus, from where they continued to behave badly until more galactic police finally arrived to shut them down. The Greeks thought there were 12 main gods on Olympus, and they were the children of the first 2 gods, and 2 of them had 3 children named Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, and these kicked out the rest of the gods and were ruling alone from Mount Olympus, becoming the gods in 3 persons in order to sow confusion on Urantia. Angels were born fully grown and didn't understand very well what it was to be human, and angels also didn't feel pain, so it took a leap of faith for them to accept that God loved human beings and that suffering was the bridge between God and man. There was something unique and marvelous about being human, while the biggest problem for the angels was that God knew that great comedy was born of great tragedy, and both good and bad angels lacked a sense of humor. The midwear phenomenon was unique to planet Earth because many of the angels had begun consorting with human women before they had been upstepped, which was a very foolish thing to do. And after Lucifer fell, many of the bad angels mixed with the blue people and other natives, and so did Adam and Eve, who had 63 children with humans before they were given the option of either leaving the garden or being overrun by the barbarians. Adam and Eve had been warned not to allow any alien angels to breed with the natives until they had at least 500,000 children themselves, and then the upsteppers would arrive. But Eve had been listening to the fallen angels talking up the idea of speeding up evolution, and then she fell for a superior human specimen from Syria and created a child with him, and as soon as Adam found out, he went and made one with a human female from a different tribe in order to share in her sin because he loved her. While Eve had been simply deceived, Adam defaulted intentionally, and it took 70 days for Gabriel to show up with orders from universe headquarters in response to the default, and the verdict was that the spiritual energy circuits that had allowed them to live forever were being removed for everyone's good, so the material son and daughter on planet Earth were now mortal and were destined to live and die as humans. Evil Lucifer and all his fallen angels were not removed, and they would continue to wander to and fro on earth until Jesus could come to become a mortal himself, and his triumphant life would seal the fate of the fallen angels who were quarantined on earth awaiting trial. It is possible that the tree of life made humans want to live forever. And when they ate the fruit, chores weren't getting done. And just as the early American traders gave whiskey to the red man, the bad angels knew it was more harmful than helpful, but it sure made the humans more manageable in the short run. After Adam and Eve defaulted, the tree of life was kept by loyal angels in an unwalled settlement a few miles east of headquarters, while 20,000 people hid behind the walls of the garden, and the people from the tribes that Adam and Eve had unfaithfully manipulated came down like locusts being driven by a wildfire. These people had been told that the tree would make them as gods, so while they ate its fruit for years, it hadn't made them immortal, because they didn't have the right genes, and they finally burned it down in malice. And not just Adam and Eve, but all the 100 helpers had to live and die just like everybody else. The failure of Adam and Eve did not affect our organic evolution so much as it did our social and spiritual development, and 4,000 years later, the whole peninsula sank where the garden had been, along with the Sicilian land bridge to Africa, although it took a few hundred years to become completely submerged. Some of Adam's children went to Greece, and these were the smartest and most beautiful of the survivors from the Garden of Eden. The Greeks didn't take their gods on Mount Olympus very seriously, and they didn't worship them. And the Greeks came up with a philosophy that substituted knowledge about people for the salvation granted by the government of the universe. The Greeks became polluted by their slaves when they needed more slaves to take care of the slaves they already had. And they began being influenced by them, and early farmers were looked down on by the herders and hunters because the farmers were keeping slaves. The Jewish religion progressed because it believed in work, and while the Jews also believed in war, they kept an emphasis on work while the tribes in warmer climates became very lazy. The Greek gods were playing games and turning tricks while Buddha sat around meditating on the joy of poverty. But the primary advantage the Jews had was their written language, which the emissaries from the universe could put to good use. The hero of the Lucifer rebellion had been a semi-savage named Amidon, and he was a popular inspiration to everyone in outer space who tuned in to watch the story of Urantia. And even with all the trouble, the help of the alien angels had done more good than harm, as the Australian Aborigines and the Bushmen and the Pygmies of Africa remained examples of what we would be like without the influence of the angel aliens. Early humans were intrigued by intoxicants and drugs, and people worshipped fire and thought it was wonderful because coals could be given to a neighbor without losing anything, since fire just kept making more coals. And rich people were forgiven their bad behavior, since most people thought that only the rich would get into heaven. Early traders had thought it perfectly acceptable to cheat strangers, and the aliens still recognize that trait in us after watching it for centuries. And the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was because they were cheating visitors. Before the angels patiently helped humanity to evolve, primitive man was a slave to superstition and custom was merely a group habit. People would spend every waking moment doing things just so, in order to appease the ghosts, and our fear of change is a vestige of this ghost fear, while art, ceremony, and sports came out of quote-unquote vanity emotions, and on our planet Earth, we, quote, never have been wholly liberated from the slavery of custom. Fashion still unduly dominates Urantia. Urantia book, page 749. The purpose of war was limited, not unlike the old practice of bloodletting, which didn't work very well, but was dramatic enough to serve a purpose. And primitive people thought that ghosts could hurt people, so they would threaten to commit suicide on an enemy's doorstep in order to quickly win an argument. Magic was an attempt to adjust deity to conditions. Prayer is the effort to adjust the personality to the will of deity. Urantia book, page 1001. Most tribes had medicine men who became the first non-workers, And then the smiths working with metal were thought of as magic, but people were also afraid of them, and so they were called blacksmiths, while the medicine men were whitesmiths. The first contest between religion and science was won by the superstitious majority who ran the blacksmiths out of town, and after being banished from the villages, the blacksmiths started the noble trade of innkeeping. People would pay for their travels by telling stories, and while the language barrier was a problem, money was the universal tongue, and peace came through fostering trade, which was the way to improve communication and transportation. The marketplace was considered safe from battle, so the market served as a refuge for fugitives and a common ground and meeting place where people were not allowed to fight. When everybody put their money in a bank, they would all rush to defend it, and this was the beginning of the military. Soldiers were paid to protect the people's money, while police were invented to protect people, but policing evolved into protecting people's property, while people were supposed to be able to defend themselves. The Urantia book said that private property is the root of happiness, and that red people never caught on to the idea of private property. And it said that war was useful for moving tribes around and for mixing up the gene pool. Dancing started as a military exercise, and the first people to know peace were tribes who hated foreigners, and they thought it was a virtue to kill aliens and would sometimes have rock-throwing fights just for practice. War was always fought by some fool who wanted to be king, and primitive people would pile stuff up and then show off by burning it, or they would give it away in lavish displays to show others how powerful they were, and that would be handed down to become the Christmas tradition, and wealthy people would murder dozens of their slaves to show their disdain for wealth. Churches began as secret clubs used by the king to collect taxes, and the churches were used by merchants to collect debts, and the executive, judicial, and legislative functions of the tribe grew out of real practice, because when they were dealing with current problems it was judicial, and making plans for the future was legislative, and enforcing the law was executive. As angels came to teach the triune nature of God and to prepare the way for the coming of Jesus, they showed up with an important Melchizedek named Macaventa in 1980 BC, because it wouldn't do any good to send Jesus if people didn't first believe in God, or they would want to worship Jesus instead of God the Father. The teacher Macaventa wore a badge with 3 concentric circles, and people thought the symbol was so sacred that they never used it, so the 3 circles was soon forgotten after he left the planet. The place Macaventa lived was called Salem, and later it was called Jebus, and then Jerusalem. And for almost 100 years Macaventa taught the humans about the government of the universe, and one of his students had been Abraham. And Macaventa taught him that Jesus was not coming to placate an angry God, so they should stop sacrificing their firstborn children. People would often put their babies in baskets and float them down the river, or leave them alive in the woods to see if God would rescue them, and the angels hated that humans kept killing their children as sacrifices to appease God. The Urantia book said to look up Abiram and Segub in the Bible, and it's there in the 34th verse of the 16th chapter of 1 Kings, where the father was building the walls of Jericho and buried his boys alive in the walls. The Urantia book said, man should be unafraid to talk to God, but only a spiritual child would undertake to persuade or presume to change God. Thus, in true praying, it is the sincere and trusting communication of the spiritual nature of the creature with the anywhere presence of the spirit of the Creator. Urantia book, page 1001 and 2. God answers man's prayers by giving him an increased revelation of truth, an enhanced appreciation of beauty, and an augmented concept of goodness. Prayer is a subjective gesture, but it contacts with mighty objective realities on the spiritual levels of human experience. It is a meaningful reach by the human for superhuman values. Urantia book, page 1002. The Urantia book said that according to the laws of prevailing petitions, a successful prayer needs 1. Cosmic stamina. 2. You must have tried everything that an industrious human can manage. 3. You must surrender yourself to spiritual growth. 4. You must actively choose the way of divine will. 5. You must follow that. 6. The petition must be for divine wisdom to solve specifically human problems concerned with paradise ascension. And 7. You must have living faith. The Urantia book said that happiness is a combination of self-maintenance, self-perpetuation, and self-gratification, and that a danger in democracy is an indolent majority enslaved to public opinion. And the word indolent meant habitually lazy. Habitually lazy. The book said, over and over, that people should not expect their superiors to feed them, and that, quote, the weak and the infirm have always insisted that the state compel the strong and superior to supply their wants and otherwise make good those deficiencies which all too often are the natural result of their own indifference and indolence, close quote. Urantia book, page 794. Evolution was described as, quote, advancing practical adjustment, close quote, where, quote, nature provides but one kind of justice, inevitable conformity of results to causes, close quote, Ibid. According to History Anonymous, Jesus came to show that it was possible to drink a drug and still not misbehave, and the point was that it's not the drugs and alcohol or the fruit of the tree of life that causes bad behavior, but a conscious decision towards evil. And while he asked for the sponge with the drugged wine on the cross, the opium in it didn't make him use his supernatural powers to betray his plan or to abandon his humanity or to do harm to any sick people, and thus the admonishment, heal Satan, heal, or get behind me, or follow me, was nothing more than an acknowledgement of the primacy of the human condition within the kingdom of heaven that, quote, is an exclusively spiritual brotherhood of God-knowing individuals, close quote. Urantia book, page 1088. The Urantia book said that Jesus did not require his followers to have meetings so they could recite a common creed, but so that they could do something. They could, quote, partake of the communal supper of the remembrance of his bestowal life on Urantia, close quote. Urantia book, page 1091. The life of Jesus took up the final third of the Urantia book, and that included the long version of the Lord's Prayer, and it said that we are living on a, quote, sin-stricken, evil-dominated, self-seeking, isolated world, close quote. Urantia book, page 629, to which Jesus has promised to return. The Urantia book said that none of the greater personalities mutinied with Lucifer, but that they don't know this for sure, and the possibility that some senior personalities went along with the Lucifer betrayal is one of the reasons that the trial has been dragging on for so long. But the jury is presently out, and a verdict is due any day. Because of the Adamic default, we missed out on the opportunity to become immune to most bacterial diseases, and the good angels think there is a divine reason behind all this trouble, and they're willing to wait patiently forever to find out why. And while they are curious, they are respectful of the divine plan and do not insist on getting answers. The angels will watch, the angels will wait, because the angels are full of faith, and that is in sharp contrast to the impatience of Adam and Eve. And they said that a major reason Jesus chose planet Earth was for the precise reason that it was such a disturbed place. The Church, because of overmuch false sentiment, has long ministered to the underprivileged and the unfortunate, and this has all been well, but this same sentiment has led to the unwise perpetuation of racially degenerate stocks which have tremendously retarded the progress of civilization. Urantia book, page 1088. There were only two differences between Christianity and the Mithra religion, and that was that the Christians were peaceful while the Mithrans wanted to fight wars, and the other difference was that the Christians included women. Christianity today has become a religion well adapted to the social, economic, and political mores of the white races. It has long since ceased to be the religion of Jesus, although it still valiantly portrays a beautiful religion about Jesus to such individuals as sincerely seek to follow in the way of its teaching. Urantia book, page 1085. Only the real religion of personal spiritual experience can function helpfully and creatively in the present crisis of civilization. Urantia book, page 1087. The Urantia book said that we are each given an adjuster, and that adjusters are trained on a special planet where no angels are allowed to land, and that their teachers are adjusters themselves, whose mortals have declined to proceed. Adjusters are not like angels because they do not fall, and they are also invisible to most angels, so they are like secret television cameras. And adjusters are also called mystery monitors, or are called the pilot light, or the light of life, and their hope is to get a personality out of you. Adjusters give us spirituality and we give them personhood, and all angels wish they could have adjusters of their own, but only mortal human types get them, and we are also given a guardian angel. Becoming a human being is called the creature experience, and the adjusters don't care what gender the mortal is because there is no difference in the spirit between male and female, and an adjuster is sent as soon as the human child makes their first moral decision, described as a choice between good and evil, and that usually happens a few months before their 6th birthday. And now here's the bad news. Adjusters are not here to make our lives easier. Quote, rather, they are concerned in making your life reasonably difficult and rugged so that decisions will be stimulated to prepare you for the eternal adventure to assure your survival. Urantia book, page 1192. We cannot fall from ignorance or fear, but only from willful resistance, and it's possible that adjusters can sometimes direct our dreams. But usually when your adjuster attempts to communicate with you, the message is lost in the material currents of the energy streams of human mind. Only occasionally do you catch an echo, a faint and distant echo of the divine voice. Urantia book, page 1205. It's not so much cooperation as ceasing to resist. And we're supposed to concentrate on what is, not what might have been. And because the divine and the mortal are so different, it's very rare, but if you get in sync with your adjuster, you translate out without having to die. The Urantia book said that there is never any communication with the dead, because dead people are not allowed to contact the living or send messages under any circumstances. And when we see ghosts or something along those lines, it's just God trying to comfort us with a certainty that there is a real world beyond our limited perception. While some dead people move on right away, some are left sleeping with a group of other souls from a similar planetary age, and after death, people can be taught stuff they missed out on if they'd been handicapped or had been deprived by some accident. People can have their adjuster removed before they die from becoming spiritually bankrupt, and these people are called the living dead. And the adjuster will also leave if they're severely brain damaged, but their soul continues to live with them. The adjuster is not the soul, and neither is it the conscience, but the adjuster carries the memory and joins with the soul after death. So the adjuster is your identity, and the soul is your personality. And it takes a little while for your memory to clear up after you die, because the editors have worked through it. You won't remember stuff that's not important to cosmic living, things about the material world they call scaffolding. But you will remember people with whom you had relationships, and your spirit body will look better and better the further up the ladder you go. They won't give you a second chance, but they will try their best to give your first chance a decent try. And the book said there are over 1 trillion angels on the planet, and after all the extensive talk about faith, they finally defined faith as, quote, the individual's relation to God, close quote. Have you faith? Then have it to yourself. Urantia book, page 1091. They said that mortal man needs the sustenance of a far-flung cosmic perspective. Urantia book, page 1092, and that, quote, it is better to have a religion without a church than a church without a religion. Ibid. After listening and writing down what the sleeping man was saying about the government of the universe, the Sadlers went to Vienna in 1910 and studied for a year under Sigmund Freud while Dr. Bob was finally graduating from Rush Medical that year after having been held back a year because of his drinking. Freud had come up with the phrase, His Majesty the Baby, and he would die on the 23rd of September in 1939, and while psychological theories were all the rage, people preferred Jung to Freud because he wasn't Jewish. Dr. Bob had been allowed to transfer to Rush Medical from the University of Michigan as a junior in the fall of 1907, and Battle Creek was 70 miles due west of the University of Michigan by train, directly on the way to Chicago. Rush Medical was 120 miles west of Battle Creek, around the base of Lake Michigan, or less than 2 hours by train, and the Sadlers were teaching at the McCormick Theological Seminary that was 6 miles away from Rush Medical after they'd graduated from Rush in 1906, and there was every likelihood that the Sadlers and Dr. Bob shared many of the same professors. The bulk of the Urantia book would be written from 1934 to 1935, and it mentioned prayer and meditation on page 1387, and conscious contact on page 1421, and spiritual experience on page 1732, and while only a small number of those in what they were calling the Contact Committee ever knew who the sleeping subject was, it had been kept secret so people wouldn't want to worship the channeler. The rumor was that it was Wilfred Custer Kellogg, and he would die on the 31st of August in 1956, within a year of the Urantia book's publication. The story was that Wilfred Kellogg had wanted to marry his first cousin, Anna Kellogg, who was Lena Sadler's sister, but it was against the law for first cousins to marry. So the Sadlers invited Wilfred and Anna, to live with them in Chicago, while arrangements could be made for them to marry. There was a wedding announcement in the September 1912 edition of the Lucamite and Talent magazine, volume 6, page 65, that said, the announcement of the double wedding of Miss Sarah Mildred Wilmer and Miss Anna B. Kellogg appeared in the Sunday, August 25 issue of the Chicago Tribune, together with large portraits of the young ladies, 3 columns in width. This double ceremony was performed at the home of Dr. William S. Sadler at LaGrange, Illinois, on August 28. Miss Wilmer wedded Edward Van Bond of Dallas, Texas, and Miss Kellogg wedded Wilfred Custer Kellogg of Battle Creek, Michigan. Both of these young ladies have made their home during recent years with Doctors William and Lena Sadler and are members of the well-known Sadler Company. In the Chicago Medical Recorder, Volume 34, Number 9, September 15, 1912, there was an entry, Dr. and Mrs. William Sadler of LaGrange have announced the marriage of their sister, Miss Annabelle Kellogg, to Wilfred Custer Kellogg of Battle Creek, Michigan, on August 28. 2 years after the wedding, Dr. Bob's father brought his son home after Bob had been hospitalized a dozen times because of his drinking, and Bob would remain sober for 5 years after staying with his father for 4 months in early 1914. Dr. Bob would start drinking again when Prohibition was passed, and he would drink for the next 17 years. Dr. Bob's son was born in June of 1918, 1 year before Prohibition, and he was called Smitty, And Smitty had a newspaper route that went past the huge rubber people's estates, and Smitty had a motorcycle before his father bought him a Ford V8 Roadster in 1934 that could outrun the cops. When Smitty was 16 years old, his car finally burned up its tires that had lasted 4,000 miles. And when Smitty graduated from high school, his father made him secretly get married to a girl he'd gotten pregnant, and Smitty was granted a divorce 3 years later, quote, after a discreet interval, close quote. Children of the Healer, page 99. Smitty never saw his daughter, but paid child support for 18 years, and when he couldn't, Dr. Bob did. The Chrysler dealership paid Smitty and his friends 50 cents apiece to go to Cleveland and drive back new cars, and the city of Cleveland was 40 miles north of Akron on the shore of Lake Erie. And a group of them were speeding, as usual, he said, and the driver was arrested, and when Smitty urinated in the judge's spittoon, he was also arrested. Smitty would write, "I did terrible in school. You ought to see my transcript. The only A I ever got was in ROTC. Children of the Healer, page 122. My father made me go to college. All I wanted was to get a job at the gas station and put squirrel tails on the antenna of my Chevy." Ibid. When Smitty was 5 years old, Dr. Bob had adopted a girl Smitty's age to keep him company. And Suzanne Smith's baby name was Winona Mary. And Suzanne had been adopted in 1923 and would live with the Smiths in Akron for 17 years. When Smitty was 11 years old in 1929, Dr. Bob went for further medical school at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, so he could become a surgeon proctologist, and somewhere along the line, Dr. Bob got a tattoo of a blue dragon with red flames that went around his left arm from his shoulder to his wrist, and Dr. Bob had also gotten a tattoo of a compass with 32 points, and when asked about them, he would make a joke about how drunk he must have been at the time. Smitty said that Dr. Bob, quote, was an extremely intelligent guy. He had studied Latin and Greek for many years. He used to speak German when he bought his surgical stuff from the Krupp salesman, close quote. Children of the Healer, page 110. Then he bought himself a second-hand Pierce arrow, which we called the Fierce Error. At any rate, when we made this trip to Vermont, Susie and I both went with him, and he drank all the way. He got into the beer on the way up, so I got to do the driving. Of course, I wasn't old enough to drive, but I loved it, even though I had to look through the steering wheel. He sat over in the right seat, throwing the beer cans out the window. A state trooper in New York stopped us. I guess the car looked like a runaway, with just my head sticking up. He made my father get back under the steering wheel and drive, and he didn't say anything about Dad's drinking. When we got to the Vermont-New York border, he really loaded up with beer because he thought Vermont was dry, even though it had gone wet in the meantime. Children of the Healer, page 118 and 19. By 1929, business had slowed down after the stock market crash, and the Smiths quickly became very poor, and Dr. Bob's old Hudson was stolen. So Dr. Bob bought another car, and while their poverty was blamed on the economy when Smitty was young, he realized later that it was more likely because of his dad's drinking. I didn't realize that he was doing things that would allow him to drink more. It wasn't until I was a teenager that I noticed he never scheduled any operations before 11 o'clock. Children of the Healer, page 105. Suzanne said that she especially liked her parents going to the Oxford group meetings, because when they were gone she could sneak out to be with her boyfriend Ray Windows. And attendance at the Oxford groups had done little to slow down Dr. Bob's drinking. On the 10th of June in 1935, Bill W. gave Dr. Bob a bottle of beer so he could operate on a patient, and Bob also took a sedative to which Bill gave the popular name of Goofballs, and the operation went well, and 2 weeks later, at 2 weeks sober, Dr. Bob had to go to the American Medical Association convention in Atlantic City. Dr. Bob had attended the annual AMA convention every year for the past 20 years, and he started drinking the moment he got on the train, and that would be the last AMA convention he would ever attend. Dr. Bob called it a slip, and believed thereafter that the founding of AA was Mother's Day in 1935, and the question remained whether it had been a slip or a headlong plunge. Bill W. was 5 months sober when he'd gotten to Akron, and told Dr. Bob that he'd done it by sitting in Oxford or meetings with like-minded people, and that only meetings with other real alcoholics worked. Not just to keep Bill W. sober, but to inspire and thrill him beyond his best-ever day drinking. To show Bob exactly how it worked, Bill W. stayed with Dr. Bob and Ann for 90 days to hold sober meetings at Dr. Bob's house, and their third member's sobriety date was the 26th of June in 1935, and he checked out of the hospital a free man on the 4th of July. Bill and Dr. Bob were about to meet Bill D., a stocky, handsome man with a captivating drawl, a congenial, folksy manner, and a full head of wavy hair, which would turn white in his later years. At the time of their phone call, this congenial and folksy soul had just beaten up 2 nurses and was strapped down in a bed at City Hospital. Pass it on, page 152 and 3. In late June of 1935, Dr. Bob put in a call to Akron City Hospital. He explained to the nurse in the receiving ward that a man from New York had just found a cure for alcoholism. The nurse, who apparently had not heard about Dr. Bob's own recent recovery, asked why he didn't try the cure out on himself. When Dr. Bob explained that he had tried it and that it involved working with other alcoholics, she responded more sympathetically. She knew just the man, she said, and he was at that very moment in the hospital with DTs. He would be sufficiently sober to talk with them in a day or two. Ibid. Dr. Bob's house had 3 bedrooms, and with Bill W. staying there, and then with the lawyer AA number 3, the kids were sent to sleep in the attic, which Suzanne liked just fine so she could sneak out the window to see her boyfriend Ray. When they started having drunks over to the house, Minister Wright came over and told Dr. Bob that he wasn't welcome in the Presbyterian church anymore. It was causing a lot of friction among the congregation. What he was trying to tell him was that alcoholics weren't very desirable, and they weren't really church material. My mother and father were very hurt. Children of the Healer, page 127. Dr. Bob took his kids to a synagogue and to a Catholic church and to all the Protestant denominations, and they even went to hear from Christian Scientists. I think maybe he was trying to teach us that every person has their own concept of God. No 2 of us have the same conception. Ibid. So they joined the Episcopalians, which was Dr. Tunk's church, and the Smiths kept going for the rest of their lives, and Smitty spent some time dating Tunks's daughter. The early AAs would think of, quote, light bulbs and Third Avenue buses, close quote, in their quest to find an understanding of God, and they would continue having seances well into the 40s. Ann Smith had graduated from Wellesley with a degree in teaching, and she wore the same black dress to every meeting, and Ann had come from a family that was in the who's who. Her father was a manager for the Santa Fe Railroad, and Ann's uncle Charles T. Ripley was their president, and Ann's brother had become the chief engineer of the Santa Fe Railroad. Smitty said that his mom would listen to the opera on the radio every Sunday, and that Dr. Bob never failed to stand up when a lady entered the room, and the Akron meetings allowed the wives to attend, because Dr. Bob thought that the wives should come hear the alcoholics' stories to find out that their own husbands were not the worst drunks on the earth. The women said, well, it was the Depression. We had to stick with them whether we wanted to or not. We had to eat, and the kids had to eat. Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, a biography, with recollections of early AA in the Midwest, New York, Alcoholics Anonymous World Services, Inc., 1980, page 236. When Bill W. got back to New York from Akron, he and Lois opened their house to suffering alcoholics while Lois worked at Lozier's full-time, and she still cooked all their meals at home. One rich drunk got mad because Lois didn't make enough pancakes one morning, and later when he was dying of cancer in Bellevue Hospital, the rich man asked a friend to bring him some alcohol, but by the time the friend got back with the booze, the rich guy was dead. Bill W. had returned to New York on the 26th of August in 1935, and none of the people who stayed with the Wilsons got sober, and the following summer, Bill and Lois learned that it is possible to kill people with kindness. Bill W. and Lois had gone to see a company in Maryland for some market analyzing, and they'd left behind one of their prospects in their house, and he sold all their good clothes for money because he was a card gambler, and then he gassed himself in their oven, and had been laying there for a while when Bill and Lois returned. As Bill W. continued to meet with failure in getting his prospects sober, he took Lois out to Akron to meet Dr. Bob and Ann, where at the time there were several Catholics and Jews in their meetings, and the alcoholics were quitting, not because they didn't love to drink, but because they loved being sober more, and their sobriety would start when they stopped wanting to be sick and started wanting to be well. The first AA group in Cleveland were mostly Catholics who disagreed with the Oxford groups, and these would be the first to call themselves Alcoholics Anonymous after the title of the big book. And they started their own meeting instead of driving to Akron to share with those adhering more closely to the Oxford groups. Catholic Slovenians had come to America between 1905 and 1913, and they'd settled mainly in Cleveland, which explains the Gothic lettering in the popular AA slogans. The Cleveland group decided not to talk about spiritual matters too strongly at first, but would talk with the alcoholic's family while the drunk was in the hospital, and the AAs would wait a few days until an approach could be made, which they called, quote, a lucid interval, or a moment of clarity. When you discover a prospect for Alcoholics Anonymous, find out all you can about him. If he does not want to stop drinking, don't waste time trying to persuade him. You may spoil a later opportunity. This advice is given for his family also. They should be patient, realizing they are dealing with a sick person. If there's any indication that he wants to stop, have a good talk with the person most interested in him, usually his wife. Get an idea of his behavior, his problems, his background, the seriousness of his condition, and his religious leanings. You need this information to put yourself in his place, to see how you would like him to approach you if the tables were turned. Sometimes it is wise to wait till he goes on a binge. The family may object to this, but unless he is in a dangerous physical condition, it is better to risk it. Don't deal with him if he is very drunk, unless he is ugly and the family needs your help. Wait for the end of the spree, or at least for a lucid interval. Then let his family or friend ask him if he wants to quit for good, and if he would go to any extreme to do so. If he says yes, then his attention should be drawn to you as a person who has recovered. You should be described to him as one of a fellowship who, as part of their own recovery, try to help others, and who will be glad to talk to him if he cares to see you. If he does not want to see you, never force yourself upon him. Neither should the family hysterically plead with him to do anything. Nor should they tell him much about you. They should wait for the end of his next drinking bout. You might place this book where he can see it in the interval. Here no specific rule can be given. The family must decide these things. Alcoholics Anonymous, page 90 and 91. Lois fit in well with the Smiths in Akron because they had the mutual understanding of the Oxford group movement, and their husbands had become inseparable. Lois had thrown her shoe at Bill W. for going to so many Oxford group meetings in New York City while he was searching for alcoholics to help him stay sober. And she'd seen Bill's desperation to find more sober prospects, such as Dr. Bob had access to through the hospital in Akron, and so Lois had suggested that Bill take her to visit the Smiths in Akron for a while at the end of 1937, and she reminded Bill that although he was not finding any members for his own group, the quest had succeeded in keeping him sober himself. Bill W. had distanced himself from the Oxford groups, in large part because they didn't like the Catholics, and he thought this would discourage the Irish. So Lois and Bill had been on their own, trying to get people sober, while back in Akron, Dr. Bob was working with the hospitals and having a much better time of it. The only thing that really worked was to bring a person into a hospital and talk to them after they had become sober after some little time, whether it took a day or 3 days or a week or more, and that method became effective, and the rest is history anonymous. Dr. Bob was a prominent man in Akron. Everybody knew him. When he stopped drinking, people asked, "What's this not drinking liquor club you've got over there?" "A Christian fellowship," he'd reply. "That's because we started meetings with a prayer and ended them that way." Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 118 and 19. When another doctor got sober, his hospital in turn cooperated with the AAs, and Dr. Bob visited that hospital to explain the procedure, beginning with newcomers being admitted to the hospital and put into a private room for a week or so with only a Bible to read. Dr. Bob would let them drink whiskey in the hospital, but they had to drink a decent shot of praldehyde first. That dose of praldehyde would render them unconscious for upwards of 3 days, and when they came to, Dr. Bob would tell them that they had become sensitized to alcohol, like a diabetic or someone with allergies, and that they must not drink another drop or the consequences could be fatal. The standard became a 10-day stay, and the only reading material the new AAs were allowed during that first hospitalization was the Bible. And it may seem contradictory, but many of these Bible-reading people were both superstitious and regularly enjoyed dabbling in the occult. There were astrologers on every street corner, and people held nightly seances in most neighborhoods, along with table-tapping parties and card readings and other gypsy practices. And in the name of science, people would get hypnotized at parties. And all this occult behavior was not just great fun, but they were also deadly serious about it. Bill and Lois went to Nantucket, an old whaling town in New England, and they stayed at a house on the beach. And while Lois was sleeping, a ghost came into the kitchen while Bill was drinking coffee, and the ghost said that he was a sailor and that he wished he could have a drink. People frequently saw ghosts and other spiritual manifestations, and back in Russia, Rasputin had not been an anomaly but a creature of the times, and with immigration from the old world into America, untold manners of superstition and psychic parlor games had come with them into the American Midwest. On May 24, 1949, at the invitation of Rochester's Dr. Kirby Collier, one of AA's earliest admirers among psychiatrists, Bill was invited to participate in an alcoholism symposium to be presented at the American Psychiatric Association meeting in Montreal. A number of APA members were unenthusiastic about being addressed by a layman. About this, Bill liked to tell an anecdote on himself. After his talk, a past president of the APA had declared that, quote, "Outside of the few AAs in the room and myself, I do not think a single one of my colleagues believed a word of your explanation," close quote. When Bill expressed surprise at this and mentioned how much applause he had received, the man replied, "Well, Mr. Wilson, you AAs have 100,000 recoveries, and we in the psychiatric profession have only a few. They were applauding the results, much more than the message. Pass it on, page 334. After Bill W.'s white light experience, he read William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, a study in human nature, that had been written in 1902, and in James's book, Bill learned that to get well, one must be totally desperate and become willing to admit it, and then one must find a higher power and stop supposing they can solve their problems themselves or that they would have done it by now. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. Alcoholics Anonymous, quoting Dr. Jung, page 27. Any good drunk worth their salt readily and enthusiastically signed on to the theory of ultimate and irrevocable disaster described by the anonymous writers of the Big Book. We are like the passengers of a great liner the moment after rescue from shipwreck, when camaraderie, joyousness, and democracy pervade the vessel from steerage to captain's table. Unlike the feelings of the ship's passengers, however, our joy in escape from disaster does not subside as we go our individual ways. Alcoholics Anonymous, page 17. It was no mere coincidence in the spiritual world that the Titanic had left from Waterloo Station, and AAs are told in the meetings that failing to work the steps is just like changing chairs on the Titanic. Near you, alcoholics are dying helplessly like people in a sinking ship. If you live in a large place, there are hundreds, high and low, rich and poor. These are future fellows of Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous, page 152. Bill W. would also write, like a gaunt prospector belt drawn in over the last ounce of food, our pick struck gold. Close quote. Alcoholics Anonymous, page 128. The AAs met in private homes until January of 1940, when they moved the meeting to King's School where they would pay rent. And before the meetings they would discuss the other members and steer the next meeting towards the newcomers who needed specific help. After the meetings they would criticize each other's talks, making suggestions and developing arguments, and Dr. Bob said that they became, quote, amateur psychologists and after-dinner speakers, close quote. About all that can be said with reasonable certainty is that meetings last an hour to an hour and a half, and even that's not always the case. Alcoholics Anonymous, Cult or Cure, by Charles Booth, San Francisco, C. Sharp Press, 1991, page 13. After 4 years, Dr. Bob's hospital had enough of the drunks because they owed a lot of money, and AAs were in debt to other hospitals as well. And some early AAs began putting people up in their homes and charging them $12 a week. The tradition became that they would make sure the newcomer knew all about the program before being allowed into a meeting, and 2 out of 3 of their prospects got sober. Dr. Bob got into this with Goodrich and then with Goodyear. Finally, we had a deal with 3 rubber companies that if they had anyone they wanted us to try and sober up, they would call us. And in turn, if we had someone we had sober who needed a job, we could call them. We worked that out for several years in the 1940s, and it worked good. We even had a judge Dr. Bob, was involved with. This judge used to issue a summons for a guy to join AA. Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, page 288. After 4 years of sobriety, things started looking up for Dr. Bob, and he was able to give Smitty an allowance for college, so as a student, Smitty could quit his paper route. Smitty had enrolled in Akron University in 1936, and the campus was 2 miles away from Dr. Bob's house. And Smitty had started out studying mechanical engineering and got a degree in accounting 5 years later. The Selective Service Act was passed on the 16th of September in 1940, requiring all men between the ages of 18 and 36 to register, and the draft began the following month, with the first getting inducted on the 18th of October, and as soon as he graduated in 1941, Smitty went right into the Army. I was thrilled to death to have a job. I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Quartermaster Corps and sent to a truck company in Fort Benning, Georgia. You know, the Army, in its infinite wisdom, sent me to a truck company because I majored in accounting. Children of the Healer, page 133.